The auction block was rotting wood and desperation. Catherine had stopped counting the days since she'd been dragged here. Wrists rubbed raw beneath iron manacles that had belonged to a dozen captives before her. The crowd barely looked at her anymore, another broken slave in a market glutted with misery. "Do I hear 50 silver?" The auctioneer's voice had gone hoarse with repetition. "Surely someone needs labor. Kitchen work? Field clearing?" Silence answered him. The merchants and minor lords shifted restlessly, eyes already moving toward the next lot. Catherine was too thin, too scarred, her healing gift suppressed by malnutrition until it was barely a flicker. She'd watched stronger specimens sell for hundreds while she languished, price dropping with each humiliating reset. 40 silver? Desperation crept into the auctioneer's tone. She's young, yet can be fattened up. "No one wants Ashford blood," someone called from the crowd, and nervous laughter rippled through the assembly. The name still carried poison, even after all these years. Catherine's jaw tightened, but she kept her eyes down. Defiance only earned beatings, and she'd learned to hoard her strength for survival rather than pride. 30 silver, then. Surely 30. 20. 15. The bids came as insults now, each one lower than the last, each voice tinged with mockery. The auctioneer's face had gone red with frustration and shame. A failed auction reflected poorly on the house, suggested poor judgment in acquiring stock. 10 silver, he announced, voice cracking. Final offer before she goes to the labor camps unsold. The crowd parted like water before a ship's bow. Catherine felt the change before she saw it, the sudden hush, the instinctive shuffle of bodies creating space. She raised her eyes and immediately wished she hadn't. The man moving through the crowd wore authority like other men wore cloaks. Tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair and eyes the color of winter sky. Young, perhaps 25, but carrying himself with the certainty of someone who'd never been questioned. Warriors flanked him, hands on sword hilts, scanning for threats that didn't exist because no one would dare. The auctioneer had gone pale. "Your Majesty, we didn't expect the offerings today are hardly worthy of 5,000 gold. The words fell like stones into still water. The crowd's collective gasp was audible. 5,000 gold could buy an estate, raise an army, fund a city's reconstruction. For a slave worth 10 silver, it was incomprehensible. Catherine's heart hammered against her ribs. This was wrong, terribly, fundamentally wrong. No one spent that kind of money without reason, and the way those ice-blue eyes fixed on her promised nothing good. "Your Majesty is most generous, but perhaps you haven't been informed of this particular slave's," the auctioneer stammered. Catherine Ashford. The king's voice cut through the babbling like a blade through silk. He pronounced each syllable with crystalline clarity, making sure every person in the market heard. Daughter of Edmund and Margaret Ashford, of the northern merchant houses, last surviving member of her bloodline. The crowd's murmurs turned sharp, dangerous. The Ashford name meant something here, something that made people spit and curse. Catherine had never understood why her family had been wool traders. Her childhood, comfortable but unremarkable. Then everything had burned, and she'd been running ever since. The king descended the steps to the auction block with measured precision, each footfall deliberate, each movement calculated for maximum impact. He stopped directly before her, close enough that she could see the muscle jumping in his jaw, the rigid control holding back something volcanic. "I know exactly who you are." His voice dropped low, meant only for her, but somehow still carrying to the breathless crowd. "I know what your family did to mine. The betrayal, the murders, the cowardice when confronted. 15 years I've waited for this moment. 15 years searching for any surviving Ashford, praying one still drew breath." Catherine's mouth went dry. "I don't know what your—" Silence. The word cracked like a whip. His hand shot out, gripping her jaw hard enough to bruise, forcing her to meet his gaze. "You will speak when given permission. You will breathe when I allow it. I didn't buy you to save you, Catherine Ashford. I bought you so I could break you slowly, publicly, completely. So I could make sure you understand every single consequence of what your family did to mine." His eyes burned with hatred so pure it was almost beautiful in its terrible intensity. This wasn't casual cruelty or random violence. This was personal, intimate, cultivated over years like a poisonous garden. "My father died, choking on his own blood," the king continued, voice never rising but somehow filling the entire square. "Poisoned at a treaty table by Ashford treachery. His retinue slaughtered while your family's guards held the doors, and then you all vanished like the cowards you were, leaving only corpses and unanswered questions behind." "That's not, I don't." Catherine's protest died as his grip tightened. "You'll learn the truth of it. Every detail. I'll make certain of that." He released her face and stepped back, addressing the auctioneer without breaking eye contact with Catherine. "The gold will be delivered within the hour. Prepare the transfer documents." "Of course, Your Majesty. At once, Your Majesty." The auctioneer was already scribbling frantically. Guards moved forward to claim her. Catherine's legs nearly buckled as they unlocked her chains from the post, only to replace them with heavier manacles bearing the king's personal seal. The weight of them felt like prophecy. "What's your name?" she whispered as they began dragging her toward the royal contingent's horses. The king smiled, and it was the coldest thing she'd ever seen. "Alexander Sterling, Alpha King of the Northern Territories. Son of Marcus Sterling, the man your family murdered." He gestured to his guards. "Take her to the fortress. Put her in the West Tower cell, the one that overlooks the memorial garden. I want her to see my father's monument every morning when she wakes, a reminder of exactly why she's there." As they hauled her away, Catherine caught fragments of crowd conversation excited, whispers about the Ashford-Sterling feud, speculation about what revenge the young king planned, bets on how long she'd survive. The market had found its entertainment for the day. She'd thought the auction was the bottom, that random cruelty from random masters was the worst fate available. But as the fortress loomed ahead, all black stone and sharp towers, Catherine understood with sinking certainty that she'd been wrong. She'd traded random cruelty for something far more dangerous. Calculated destruction by a man who'd spent 15 years nurturing his hatred into an art form. Whatever her family had supposedly done, she was about to pay for it in ways she couldn't yet imagine. And the worst part, the part that made her stomach twist with helpless dread, was that she had no idea what crime she was even being punished for. The fortress gates closed behind her with the finality of a tomb sealing. The mountain road was endless and cruel. 3 days Catherine walked in chains behind Alexander's horse, wrists bound and tethered like an animal. The warriors made a game of it, riding close enough to spray mud with their horses' hooves, calling out suggestions for her punishment, placing bets on how long before she begged for mercy. Uncle William led the chorus. Older than Alexander by 2 decades, with silver threading his dark hair and cruelty etched into every line of his weathered face, he seemed to take particular pleasure in her suffering. "The Ashford bitch stumbles," he announced gleefully when she tripped over exposed roots on the second day. "Perhaps we should drag her the rest of the way? Save her the trouble of walking." Laughter erupted from the warriors. Catherine pushed herself upright, tasting blood where she'd bitten her tongue, and kept moving. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction. By the 3rd day, her body had nothing left. Dehydration blurred her vision. Her legs moved on instinct alone, each step a negotiation with muscles that had given up miles ago. When she finally collapsed, face first into cold mud, she almost welcomed it. Alexander reined his horse around. Catherine waited for the kick, the whip, the inevitable escalation. Instead, she heard him dismount. "Get up," he commanded. She tried. Her arms wouldn't support her weight. The mud was almost comfortable compared to walking. "I said, I heard you." Her voice emerged as a croak. "I can't." Silence stretched. Then hands gripped her shoulders, not gently, but not violently either, and lifted her from the mud. Alexander's face remained utterly blank as he carried her to his horse, settling her in front of him before remounting. "Don't mistake this for kindness," he said against her ear as they began moving again. "I simply won't have you dying before I'm finished." Catherine had no energy to respond. She slumped against him, hating that his warmth was the first comfort she'd felt in days, hating him for the confusion of cruelty and care that made no sense. The fortress appeared as the sun set, all black stone and sharp angles, built into the mountainside like a scar. Warriors patrolled walls bristling with weapons. Training yards echoed with the clash of steel. This was a place built for war and nothing softer. William met them in the courtyard, his smile widening when he saw Catherine's condition. "Excellent. She looks appropriately humbled." "Show her the chamber," Alexander ordered, dismounting and pulling Catherine down after him. Her legs buckled, but guards caught her, hauling her upright. William led them through torch-lit corridors that grew progressively colder and damper. The chamber waited at the end, a stone room filled with instruments Catherine recognized from nightmares. Chains hanging from ceiling beams, a table with leather restraints, tools whose purposes were unmistakable in their careful arrangement. "Your family destroyed ours," Alexander said, voice flat and final as a death sentence. "Murdered my father, slaughtered his retinue, stole our resources, and fled into the night. Now I'll destroy what's left of yours." His eyes met hers. "You." Catherine looked at the instruments, at William's eager anticipation, at Alexander's cold certainty. Something hard crystallized in her chest, not defiance exactly, but a fundamental refusal to disappear quietly. "Then you've wasted 5,000 gold on disappointment." Her voice was hoarse but steady. "I don't break." William's smile transformed into something delighted and terrible. "Oh, this will be entertaining. They always say that, nephew. Every single one." And yet he gestured at the implements around them. "Eventually, they all sing whatever song we request." "Eventually isn't the same as quickly," Catherine replied, meeting his gaze. "How patient are you?" Alexander's hand shot out, gripping her throat, not choking, but holding her in place as he leaned close. "I have 15 years of patience stored up, Catherine Ashford. I can make this last as long as necessary." "Good." She forced the word past his grip. "Because I have no idea what you're talking about. My family were merchants. We sold wool. We never murdered anyone." His hand tightened fractionally. "Lies upon lies, just like your father." "Then this will take a very long time," she whispered, "because I can't confess to crimes I know nothing about." He released her abruptly, stepping back. Something flickered across his face, frustration or doubt or anticipation, gone too quickly to name. "Take her to her cell," he commanded the guards. "Let her contemplate truth versus stubbornness. We begin tomorrow." As they dragged her away, Catherine caught William, watching her with calculating interest, like a craftsman assessing a particularly challenging piece of material. She'd meant what she said. She wouldn't break. But as the cell door slammed shut and darkness swallowed her, Catherine couldn't suppress the cold fear, whispering that everyone had their breaking point. The question was only whether Alexander would find hers before she discovered why she was really here. Alexander's education began at the first feast. Catherine was hauled from her cell as torches were lit in the great hall, thrust into a servant's rough tunic and shoved toward the kitchens. The head cook, a woman with burns scarring half her face, looked at her with something between pity and contempt. "Wine service," she said shortly. "Keep the cups filled. Don't speak unless spoken to. Don't meet anyone's eyes." The great hall roared with warriors already deep in their cups. Catherine moved between tables with a heavy pitcher, hands shaking as she poured. The conversations washed over her like waves, hunting stories, training boasts, crude jokes, until Alexander rose from the head table. "A toast," he called, and the hall fell silent. "To my father, Marcus Sterling, murdered 15 years ago this week, by Ashford treachery." The words hung in the air like smoke. Every eye found Catherine. The Ashfords invited him to treaty negotiations, Alexander continued, voice carrying to every corner. Promised alliance, cooperation, mutual prosperity. Instead, they served him poisoned wine and watched him choke on his own blood while their hired guards slaughtered his retinue. Cowards! Someone shouted. Butchers! Catherine's grip on the pitcher tightened. This wasn't how it happened, it couldn't be. Her father had been a merchant, her mother a weaver. They'd never commanded guards, never hosted treaty feasts, never. The girl looks confused, William observed from Alexander's right. Perhaps she doesn't remember her family's crimes? I remember my family, Catherine said before she could stop herself. They were good people who... The blow came from behind, a warrior's fist to her kidney that sent her sprawling. Wine spilled across stone, the pitcher clattering away. The Ashford speaks without permission, the warrior announced. Alexander descended from the dais with measured steps. He crouched beside her, voice low enough that only she could hear. You will serve silently. You will listen to every word. You will learn exactly what your family did, and perhaps, eventually, you'll understand why you're here. I can't confess to something I didn't do, she gasped. Then you'll suffer until you remember the truth. He stood, addressing the hall. Continue the feast. Let her hear our stories. Let her understand the depth of Ashford betrayal. The stories came all night, how the Ashfords had stolen 3 cartloads of silver meant for widow pensions, how they'd been plotting against Marcus for months, forging alliances with rival packs, how Edmund Ashford had personally selected the poison, something slow and agonizing, so Marcus would suffer. Each detail was worse than the last, and none of it matched anything Catherine knew about her family. When she tried to speak again, she was struck. When she refused to serve wine to a particularly cruel warrior, food was denied. When she called them liars, she was dragged back to her cell and locked in absolute darkness for 2 days. Yet through it all, she couldn't apologize for crimes that made no sense. On the 3rd night, after another brutal feast, an elderly woman slipped into her cell. Elizabeth moved with the careful quietness of someone practiced at invisibility, carrying salve and bread hidden in her apron. Quickly, she whispered, dabbing ointment on Catherine's split lip. Before the guards return. Why help me? Elizabeth's weathered hands paused. Her eyes, sharp despite her age, studied Catherine's face with unsettling intensity. Because something doesn't fit, child. What do you mean? I was here 15 years ago. Saw the Ashford delegation when they arrived for the treaty feast. Elizabeth's voice dropped even lower. I saw the daughter they brought. She was perhaps 13 then, and she looked nothing like you. Catherine's breath caught. What? Brown hair, not gold. And a birthmark here. Elizabeth touched her own left cheek, distinctive as a brand, shaped like a crescent moon. Everyone remarked on it. Her fingers moved to Catherine's unmarked cheek. You have neither the hair nor the mark. Then who? I don't know. Elizabeth pressed bread into Catherine's hands. But I know what I saw, and you're not her. She vanished as quickly as she'd come, leaving Catherine alone with a truth more terrifying than any torture. What if Alexander's entire revenge was built on mistaken identity? What if she was suffering for someone else's crimes? Someone else's face, someone else's life entirely. In the darkness, Catherine touched her own cheek where the birthmark should have been, and felt the first real seed of doubt take root. If she wasn't the Ashford girl from the treaty feast, then who was she, and where was the real daughter Alexander sought? The hunger had dulled Catherine's gift to barely a spark, but it hadn't died completely. She discovered this when a kitchen boy named Thomas collapsed near the wash basins, blood streaming from a gash where a falling pot had caught his temple. The cook stepped over him, muttering about carelessness, already moving on to the next task. No one stopped. No one cared. Catherine knelt beside him before thinking, pressing her palm to the wound. For a moment, nothing happened, just the sticky warmth of blood and the boy's frightened whimpering. Then something flickered deep in her chest, a guttering candle fighting to stay lit. Golden light seeped through her fingers, weak and stuttering. The gash began to close, skin knitting together in uneven pulls. It wasn't elegant or complete, she lacked the strength for that, but when she pulled away, gasping, the bleeding had stopped and the wound had sealed to an angry pink line. Thomas stared at his reflection in the wash water, touching the scar with wonder. "You're a healer." "Tell no one," Catherine whispered urgently. "Please." But kindness, like cruelty, has its own momentum. They came after dark, slipping into shadowed corners where guards didn't patrol. The laundress, with chemical burns eating through her hands. The stable master, with a festering wound from a horse's kick. The seamstress, whose fingers had been crushed in a loom accident. Always the forgotten ones, the disposable ones, the people Alexander's fortress had no use for beyond their labor. Catherine healed them all, even as each effort left her hollow and shaking. Her body had so little to give, but she gave it anyway, pouring what remained of her strength into mending people the pack had already written off. "She's not what they say," she heard a servant whisper in the corridor. "The Alpha's monster has hands gentler than any of theirs." Word spread like water finding cracks, quiet but persistent. The lower ranks began looking at her differently, not with fear or contempt, but with something dangerously close to hope. Then came the night of the scaffolding accident. The child couldn't have been more than 7, small and thin from inadequate rations. He'd been carrying supplies up the Western Tower's reconstruction when the boards gave way. Catherine heard the crack of breaking wood, the scream, the sickening thud of a small body hitting stone. She ran without thinking, shoving through the gathered workers. The boy lay twisted, left leg bent at an impossible angle, bone pressing white against skin. His father knelt helpless beside him, hands hovering but afraid to touch. "Move," Catherine commanded, already reaching for the injury. Her gift blazed brighter than it had in weeks, fed by desperation and fury that anyone would put a child on unsafe scaffolding. Golden light poured from her palms, seeking the shattered bone, coaxing fragments back into alignment. The boy's screams faded to whimpers, then silence, as the break sealed, and the bone made itself whole again. When Catherine looked up, dizzy from the effort, Alexander stood at the courtyard's edge. Her heart stopped. She waited for rage, for punishment, for whatever fresh cruelty her defiance would earn. Instead, he simply watched with those winter sky eyes, expression unreadable as carved stone. The crowd melted away. The boy's father carried his son home, murmuring grateful prayers. Still, Alexander said nothing, just studied her with that same conflicted intensity. "Why waste energy on someone else's child?" he finally asked. Catherine pushed herself to standing, legs unsteady. "Because someone has to. He's a servant's son, replaceable. He's a child with a name and a father who loves him." Her voice gained strength despite her exhaustion. "Your world is built on looking away from suffering, on deciding who matters and who's disposable. I won't be part of that. I refuse to look away just because it's easier." Something flickered across Alexander's face recognition, perhaps, or the ghost of someone he used to be before grief calcified into hatred. "You're wasting your strength," he said, but there was no heat in it. "Then it's mine to waste." They stood in silence, the space between them charged with unspoken things. Catherine braced for consequences that didn't come. Alexander simply turned and walked away, leaving her unpunished and more unsettled than any beating could have made her. That night, lying on her cell's cold stone, Catherine confronted a truth more disturbing than Alexander's cruelty. He wasn't entirely the monster he pretended to be. Monsters didn't hesitate. Monsters didn't watch with conflicted eyes. Monsters didn't walk away when they could destroy. He was capable of choice, which meant every act of cruelty was deliberate, but it also meant he could choose differently. She didn't know which possibility frightened her more, that he'd never change, or that he might. Both threatened the simple clarity of hating him completely. William struck 4 days after the healing incident. Catherine was hauled from her cell at dawn, dragged into the courtyard where the entire pack had been assembled. Warriors lined the walls, servants huddled in nervous clusters. Alexander stood on the dais beside his uncle, face unreadable as winter stone. "This creature," William's voice carried across the space with practiced authority, "has been spreading weakness among our people, teaching servants they deserve the same care as warriors, healing the worthless, while our fighters go untended." He turned to face the crowd. "She corrupts the natural order with sentiment and false compassion." Murmurs rippled through the assembled pack. Catherine's hands were bound and stretched toward the whipping post, her back exposed to cold air and hostile eyes. 50 lashes, William announced, "unless our alpha objects." The trap was perfectly laid. Every face turned toward Alexander. Stop the punishment and appear soft before the pack weakness a young alpha couldn't afford. Allow it, and prove himself the monster he claimed to be, cementing his revenge with public brutality. Catherine found Alexander's gaze across the distance. His jaw was tight, eyes storm-dark with conflict. She saw him calculating, weighing loyalty against doubt, revenge against something newer and more fragile. She made the choice for him. "Do it," Catherine's voice rang clear, despite fear clawing at her throat. "Prove your uncle right about you. Prove you're nothing but his weapon, that you can't think for yourself, that you're too afraid to—" Enough! Alexander's command cracked like lightning. He descended from the dais in 3 strides, power radiating from every movement. 3 lashes. No more. 3? William's fury barely contained itself behind a mask of concern. "The punishment is 50 for such." "I am alpha here." Alexander's eyes had gone wolf gold, dangerous in their intensity. 3 lashes for disobedience. Then she returns to her cell. "That is my command." The first lash tore fire across Catherine's shoulders. The second split skin. The third drove a scream through her clenched teeth. Then Alexander's hand caught the whip before William could continue, yanking it from the executioner's grasp. "Take her," he ordered the guards, voice flat as a blade. As they unbound her, Catherine caught William's expression, cold fury and calculation, the look of a predator whose prey had slipped the trap. He knew what Alexander's hesitation meant, and he didn't like it. Elizabeth came that night with trembling hands and desperate urgency. "I can't stay silent anymore," the old woman whispered as she cleaned Catherine's wounds with practiced gentleness. "Not after what William tried today. Child, you need to understand the truth." "What truth?" Catherine gritted her teeth against the sting of salve. "I was there 15 years ago, at the treaty feast." Elizabeth's voice dropped to barely audible. "The Ashfords didn't betray anyone. I saw Lord William in the document room the night before the feast, working alone by candlelight. When I asked what he was doing, he said preparing treaty copies." She paused, ancient eyes bright with unshed tears. "But after the poisoning, after Alpha Marcus died, I found discarded drafts in the fireplace. He'd been forging correspondence letters that made it look like the Ashfords had been plotting against Marcus for months, making it seem like they'd been planning to steal resources, weaken the alliance." Catherine's breath caught. "Why?" "The Ashfords opposed his methods, called him brutal, said he was pushing the pack toward unnecessary conflict." Elizabeth pressed something into Catherine's palm, a scrap of paper, edges charred. Edmund Ashford had publicly argued that William's raids on neighboring territories were making enemies instead of allies. He said William's approach would eventually isolate the pack, make them vulnerable. Catherine unfolded the paper carefully. The handwriting was elegant, official-looking, but something about the letter formation seemed forced, traced, rather than natural. "That's supposed to be Edmund Ashford's writing," Elizabeth whispered. "A letter allegedly sent to rival packs, offering to betray Marcus in exchange for trade advantages. But I'd seen William practice that hand for hours. I recognized his work. Does Alexander know? If he does, he's buried it beneath grief and his uncle's manipulation. Elizabeth stood, joints creaking with age and fear. William wanted war with the Ashfords because they were the only ones brave enough to oppose him, the only ones who might have convinced Marcus to rein him in. So he killed his own brother? He orchestrated everything, made the Ashfords look guilty, had them killed or scattered, and positioned himself as the grieving brother who'd guide the young Alpha. Elizabeth moved toward the door, then paused. William got exactly what he wanted: unchecked influence over a traumatized boy he could mold into a weapon. After she left, Catherine stared at the forged letter fragment in the darkness. Alexander's entire revenge was built on his uncle's lies. Every moment of her suffering, every cruelty inflicted, all of it stemmed from one man's ambition dressed as justice. And William would do anything to keep that truth buried, including forcing Alexander to destroy the one person who might make him question everything. Catherine demanded the audience on the 8th day, her back still healing from William's lashes. The guards found it hilarious at first, the broken slave requesting a private meeting with the Alpha who'd bought her for revenge. But she stood at her cell door and refused to move, refused to eat, refused to cooperate until the message reached Alexander. When they finally dragged her to his private chambers, he was waiting with that predatory stillness that made lesser people flinch. This should be entertaining. Alexander lounged in his chair, but tension coiled through his shoulders. What could my slave possibly need to tell me that requires privacy? Catherine placed Elizabeth's charred paper fragment on his desk with shaking hands. Your father wasn't murdered by the Ashfords. He was murdered by your uncle. The silence that followed was absolute and dangerous. Alexander's hand moved to the dagger at his belt with practiced ease. Choose your next words very, very carefully. I'm not who you think I am. The words tumbled out in a rush. The Ashford daughter from 15 years ago had brown hair and a crescent-shaped birthmark on her left cheek. Elizabeth saw her. I have neither. Your uncle forged documents to frame my family. That's his handwriting, pretending to be Edmund Ashford's. Elizabeth is an old woman whose mind. My family were wool merchants. Catherine's voice cracked with desperation. We owned no silver to steal. We commanded no guards to commit massacres. We never hosted treaty feasts. Nothing in your story matches anything I know about my parents, because it's not about my parents at all. Alexander rose from his chair, violence radiating from every line of his body. You expect me to believe my uncle, the man who raised me, who stood beside me through everything, orchestrated my father's murder? Ask yourself why. Catherine held her ground, though instinct screamed to retreat. What did the Ashfords oppose? Elizabeth said they called William's methods brutal, that they argued against his raids. What if your father started listening to them? What if the Ashfords knew something about William that made him dangerous to them? Enough. Why did William force that whipping 4 days ago? Catherine pressed forward desperately. Because I was healing servants? Or because you hesitated? He needed to push you back into hating me, needed to make sure you stayed his weapon. Why would he care so much unless he had something to hide? Alexander's voice had gone quiet, deadly. He sank back into his chair as if his legs couldn't hold him. He controlled everything after father died. The investigation, the evidence, the testimony, every single piece of information I have about that day came through him. Convenient, isn't it? Catherine's hands clenched. One man controls the entire narrative. One man shapes a traumatized child's understanding of his father's death. One man points that child's rage exactly where he wants it aimed. If you're telling the truth, Alexander's voice hollowed out, then I've spent 15 years hating the wrong people, building my entire rule on a foundation of lies, becoming exactly what he wanted me to become. And if I'm lying, Catherine replied quietly, meeting his storm cloud eyes. You can still kill me, nothing changes. But at least investigate first. Look at the original documents with fresh eyes. Question the inconsistencies. You owe that much to your father's memory to discover who really killed him. Alexander stared at her for a long moment, something fundamental cracking behind his carefully constructed armor. The original documents from the treaty. They'd be archived in the vault beneath the fortress. If they still exist after 15 years, then look. If I find nothing, if this is just desperate invention, then I die, knowing I tried to give you the truth. Catherine's voice steadied. But what if you find everything? What if every document William showed you was carefully curated, and the real evidence has been hidden all this time? Alexander stood abruptly, decision crystallizing into action. The vault. Tonight, after the evening meal when the corridors are emptiest. He fixed her with an intense stare. If you're manipulating me, if this is some elaborate Ashford revenge, then you'll have been fooled twice, Catherine interrupted. Once by your uncle, once by me. But I don't think you're the kind of man who gets fooled easily. I think you've been asking yourself questions for days now, and just needed permission to pursue the answers. His jaw tightened. You presume to know me? I know you hesitated with the whipping. I know you didn't punish me for healing that child. I know you carried me when I collapsed on the mountain road, even though you could have let me die. Catherine stepped closer, ignoring the danger. You're not the monster your uncle wants you to be. And that terrifies him. Alexander's hand shot out, gripping her jaw hard enough to bruise. But his eyes held something other than rage, uncertainty, fear, the dawning horror of a man realizing his entire world might be built on lies. We search the vault tonight, he said finally, releasing her, and we discover the truth, whatever it is. The vault beneath the fortress smelled of damp stone and forgotten things. Alexander dismissed the guards with curt authority, leaving only Catherine and himself among the towering shelves of leather-bound records and crumbling parchment. Lamplight threw their shadows long across the floor as they began searching. 15 years is a long time, Alexander muttered, scanning section markers. Records could be anywhere, or nowhere, or exactly where your uncle wanted them to be, Catherine replied, pulling down a ledger marked with the treaty year. She opened it carefully, pages crackling with age. Half the entries had been torn out, edges ragged and deliberate. Look, someone removed pages. They found it everywhere, gaps in correspondence logs, missing witness statements, entire sections of the investigation simply vanished. Each absence bore the same notation in the margin, written in William's distinctive hand, asterisk, removed by order of Lord William Sterling, irrelevant to proceedings, asterisk. Irrelevant, Alexander repeated, voice tight with growing fury. He decided what was irrelevant, what we were allowed to see. Catherine's hands stilled on a wooden chest shoved behind later acquisitions, dust thick across its lid. This is marked with your father's personal seal. Alexander's breath caught audibly. He knelt beside her, fingers trembling as he broke the ancient wax. Inside lay letters, journals, personal effects, never catalogued into the official archive items that should have been processed but somehow weren't. He lifted a piece of correspondence, dated 5 days before the treaty feast, his father's handwriting unmistakable in its bold, confident strokes. Asterisk, my brother William grows more unstable. Asterisk, Alexander read aloud, his voice fracturing with each word. Asterisk, he believes only through absolute dominance can we survive, that compromise equals weakness. The Ashfords oppose him openly. Now Edmund Ashford called William's proposed raids barbarism, dressed as strategy, before the entire council. William views this opposition as treason against our pack's future. Asterisk. Asterisk. I fear what he might do if I side with the Ashfords' more moderate approach, but I am Alpha, and I must choose what's right over what's expedient. The Ashfords have proven themselves honorable in every dealing. Their caution isn't cowardice, it's wisdom. Asterisk. Asterisk. I meet with them tomorrow to discuss a formal alliance that will limit William's independent authority. He cannot know of this beforehand. If he discovers, asterisk. The letter ended there, unfinished. The next day, Marcus Sterling died, choking on poisoned wine, at a feast that should have sealed an alliance. The parchment slipped from Alexander's hands. He sat back hard against a shelf, all color draining from his face. When he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. He killed my father, his own brother, because father was going to choose the Ashfords over him, because father was going to limit his power. Catherine watched him shatter. This man who'd bought her to destroy her, now destroyed himself by truth. His hands covered his face, shoulders shaking with silent, terrible grief that went deeper than rage ever could. She should have felt vindicated, triumphant. Instead, she knelt beside him and did something that defied all logic. She placed her hand gently on his shoulder. "You were a child," she said softly, 10 years old and orphaned. He manipulated your grief, shaped it into a weapon he could aim wherever he wanted. I built everything on his lies. Alexander's voice emerged, raw and broken. My rule, my purpose, my entire identity. I almost killed you for something you didn't do. Almost destroyed an innocent woman because I was too blind, too consumed by manufactured hatred to question anything. Almost. Catherine's hand remained steady despite her own trembling. But you didn't. You questioned. You investigated. You chose truth over comfortable certainty. That matters, Alexander. He looked at her, then really looked, as if seeing her for the first time, not the symbol of his revenge, not the Ashford monster his uncle had painted, but Catherine. A woman who'd suffered because of his blindness, and still offered comfort when his world collapsed around him. Why? The question barely audible. Why show me any kindness now? Because someone has to, she echoed words spoken days ago in a different context. And because you're not your uncle, you're capable of change, of choosing differently. Above them in the castle proper, William paced his chambers and noted the vault's guards had been dismissed hours ago. His nephew had been gone too long, asking too many questions. The old servant Elizabeth had disappeared after the whipping incident. He knew, with the cold certainty of a predator sensing the trap closing, that his carefully constructed lies were unraveling thread by thread. His time was running out, and cornered predators were always most dangerous. William struck at dawn, swift and merciless as winter frost. The Alpha has been compromised. His voice rang through the great hall where he'd assembled his loyalists before sunrise, warriors who'd grown comfortable with the old brutalities, commanders who preferred certainty over questions. The Ashford witch has poisoned his mind with lies and manipulation. He spends hours with her, questions my counsel, doubts the very foundation upon which this pack was built. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Alexander had been acting strange these past days, distant, conflicted, spending time in the archives when he should have been training warriors or planning raids. An alpha who cannot execute his sworn revenge is no alpha at all, William declared, each word calculated for maximum impact. For the good of the pack, for our survival, I invoke the ancient right of leadership challenge. Alexander Sterling is unfit to lead. By the time the sun fully rose, Alexander was in chains in his own dungeon, overpowered by warriors loyal to William's decades of influence. By mid-morning, Catherine knelt in the courtyard before a hastily erected execution block, wrists bound, the entire pack assembled to witness. No more delays, no more hesitation, William announced from the dais, wearing authority like a stolen crown. The Ashford dies now, and with her death, we reclaim our strength and purpose. The executioner, a brute Catherine recognized from the feasts, raised his axe with eager anticipation. She closed her eyes, thinking of Alexander discovering her body, the guilt that would haunt whatever remained of his life, the truth that would die with her. Then someone screamed, "No!" Mara, the kitchen girl with the healed arm, threw herself between Catherine and the blade. Others followed in a rush, the stable hand whose crushed foot she'd mended, the laundress with burned fingers now whole, the boy who'd fallen from scaffolding, a wave of servants and workers, creating a human barrier with their bodies. "She saved my son when no one else would look at him," a woman shouted from the crowd. "She's worth 10 of you," a man spat directly at William. The executioner hesitated, axe frozen mid-swing. William's face purpled with rage barely contained. "Move them! Cut through them if necessary! This execution will proceed!" But Catherine was already moving. Her bonds had been tied by servants' loose knots meant to slip if pulled correctly. She broke free and ran not toward the gates or safety, but toward the prison block, where William had locked away warriors over the years. Men and women who'd questioned his methods, argued for restraint, suggested mercy might not equal weakness. Her hands blazed with golden light as she reached through cell bars, pouring healing into bodies weakened by imprisonment and deliberate neglect, broken bones mended in seconds, infected wounds closed clean. Strength flooded back into muscles wasted by darkness and insufficient food. "William Sterling murdered Alpha Marcus," Catherine gasped, as they emerged blinking into daylight. "He framed the Ashfords to cover his own crimes. Alexander found proof in the archives. Your true Alpha is imprisoned for discovering the truth about his father's real killer." The freed warriors needed no further convincing. They could see William's desperation in the hasty execution, hear the fear beneath his fury, recognize tyranny standing naked and exposed before them. Alexander heard the chaos from his cell, shouts, steel clashing against steel, the building roar of conflict splitting the fortress. When his door burst open, he expected William's executioners. Instead, Catherine stood there with a stolen keyring, flanked by warriors he'd thought lost years ago. "Your pack needs you," she said simply, already unlocking his chains. He emerged into controlled chaos. William's traditionalists held the main hall and armory, fighting with practiced brutality. Catherine's rescued prisoners controlled the prison block and eastern courtyard, fighting with desperate conviction. Servants had barricaded the kitchens and storage rooms, cutting off supply lines and creating strategic bottlenecks. The fortress had fractured into civil war, those clinging to William's brutal certainty versus those who'd glimpsed the possibility of something different, something better. Alexander found Catherine in the eastern courtyard, golden light still flickering around her hands as she healed a wounded fighter. She'd assembled an army from the very people his world had deemed disposable servants, forgotten prisoners, the weak and wounded his culture had trained him to overlook. People who fought not from blind loyalty, but because she'd shown them their own value. "Well," Alexander said, drawing his sword and moving to stand beside her, "let's finish what my uncle started 15 years ago." Catherine met his eyes, and something passed between them, understanding, partnership, the recognition that some fights were worth having, no matter the cost. "Together," she agreed, and turned back to face William's advancing forces. The real battle for the pack's soul had finally begun. Alexander and William circled each other in the torch-lit courtyard, their shadows stretching long across blood-stained cobblestones. Around them, the clash of steel had quieted to watchful silence as fighters from both sides lowered their weapons, drawn by the gravity of this final confrontation. "You always were too soft," William said, his blade steady despite his age. "Your father's weakness passed down like a disease." Alexander didn't respond. His sword felt heavy in his hand, not with physical weight, but with the burden of everything he now knew. Every lesson William had taught him, every moment of praise when he'd acted ruthlessly, every whispered reassurance that mercy was naivety, all of it poison, carefully administered over years. William struck first, his blade arcing toward Alexander's throat with practiced precision. Alexander parried, but barely. His uncle fought with the certainty of a man who believed his cruelty served a greater purpose, who saw compassion as evolutionary weakness that kingdoms couldn't afford. "You think Catherine's idealism will save you?" William pressed his advantage, driving Alexander backward. "She patches up our enemies so they can kill us another day. That's not mercy, it's suicide." Behind them, Catherine moved through the wounded with desperate efficiency, her hands covered in blood that belonged to both factions. She didn't ask which side they'd fought on before binding their wounds, didn't weigh ideology against survival. A young soldier who'd charged the gates hours earlier now breathed easier because of her intervention. A guard who'd defended William's lies had his shattered arm set and splinted. "She's healing them so they can make their own choices," Alexander said, finding his footing. "Something you never allowed anyone to do." Their blades met again, the ring of steel echoing off stone walls. William was older but vicious, each strike designed not just to wound but to punish. He fought the way he'd ruled, with absolute conviction that strength required the eradication of anything soft, anything human. Alexander felt himself faltering under the weight of old shame, the false guilt William had cultivated so carefully. Every hesitation, every moment he'd questioned his uncle's methods, William had labeled weakness and trained him to suppress. "You're fighting his lies, not him." Catherine's voice cut through the fog of combat. She'd paused in her work, her eyes locked on Alexander. "You know the truth, now use it." Something shifted. Alexander stopped defending against William's blade and started defending against William's worldview. He wasn't the weak pretender his uncle had painted. He wasn't tainted by his father's mercy. He was exactly what his kingdom needed, someone who understood that strength and compassion weren't opposites, but necessary complements. His next strike drove William back, then another. The older man's certainty began to crack as Alexander pressed forward with renewed purpose. "Yield," Alexander commanded, his blade at his uncle's throat. "Confess what you did. Tell them about the murders, the forged documents, the decades of manipulation." William's eyes darted to the watching crowd, nobles and commoners alike, waiting for truth. "You haven't the stomach to kill me, boy. You never did." "I don't need to kill you," Alexander said. "I need them to hear it. All of it." For a moment, genuine fear flickered across William's face. Public truth was worse than death. It meant his legacy would crumble, his justifications exposed as the self-serving cruelty they'd always been. "I did what was necessary," William said loudly, but his voice held a tremor. "I protected this kingdom from your father's weakness, from the chaos that mercy breeds. I forged nothing. I revealed what needed revealing. I killed no one. I removed obstacles to—" His own words betrayed him. The watching crowd shifted, murmurs spreading like ripples. "Exile or execution?" Alexander said quietly. "Choose." William's answer came not with words but with sudden violence, a hidden dagger thrust toward Alexander's unguarded side. A final, treacherous strike that embodied everything he'd taught about survival, requiring ruthlessness. Alexander's blade moved on instinct, a clean parry that sent the dagger clattering away. William, overextended and off balance, stumbled forward onto Alexander's sword. The old man died by his own treachery, his final lesson the clearest he'd ever taught, that cruelty, in the end, consumes itself. The great hall felt different in daylight. Without torches casting violent shadows, it was simply a room where decisions were made, and Alexander was determined that today's decisions would unmake years of injustice. The Ashford family, he announced to the assembled court, was innocent. The evidence against them was fabricated by William to justify seizing their lands and eliminating perceived threats to his control. His voice carried clearly, though each word cost him. Catherine Ashford was wronged not once but repeatedly, by false accusation, by bondage, by every day she spent as property in this fortress. The pack shifted uneasily. Some had participated in that injustice. Others had simply witnessed it and said nothing. Catherine stood apart from Alexander, still wearing the simple healer's tunic stained with yesterday's blood. She'd spent the night in the makeshift infirmary, refusing rest while wounded still needed tending. "You're free," Alexander said, turning to face her directly. "Completely free. I offer you gold, lands, safe passage to wherever you wish to go. You owe this place nothing." The silence stretched. Catherine's eyes swept across the hall, past nobles who treated her as invisible, past soldiers she'd healed without gratitude, past the stone walls that had witnessed her captivity. The pack watched, waiting to see if their former slave would simply vanish from the nightmare they'd made of her life. "I'll stay," she said finally. Surprise rippled through the crowd. Alexander's expression remained carefully neutral, though something flickered behind his eyes, hope, perhaps, or fear that he'd misheard. "But not as property," Catherine continued, her voice gaining strength. "Not as your redemption or your absolution. I'll stay as your healer, because this pack needs to learn that caring for each other isn't weakness. That mercy isn't suicide. That strength means protecting the vulnerable, not exploiting them." She stepped forward, addressing the entire hall now. "I'll establish a true healing house. I'll train anyone willing to learn that preserving life matters as much as taking it. And I'll do it freely, by choice, not because anyone commands it." Alexander nodded slowly. "Then we have work to do. Reforms to protect the vulnerable. Systems to ensure no one else suffers what you endured. The fortress will remain strong, but strength without humanity is just cruelty wearing armor." The changes began immediately. Catherine's healing house took shape in rooms previously used for storage space that honored her work rather than hiding it. Others came to learn her art, tentatively at first, then with genuine interest. Alexander's reforms moved through the pack, like medicine through blood, uncomfortable, necessary, transformative. Weeks later, in a moment without ceremony or audience, Alexander reached for the thin metal band still circling Catherine's wrist, the last symbolic remnant of her bondage. She could have removed it herself any time. They both knew that. "May I?" he asked. She extended her arm. The clasp opened easily, and the band fell away. Catherine rubbed her wrist, feeling the absence of weight she'd carried for years. She could leave now, truly leave, with resources and protection and no obligation binding her. She stayed. Not for Alexander, though a careful partnership was growing between them. Not for forgiveness, which she offered slowly and selectively. She stayed for the future they were building, one where the next person born powerless might not suffer as she had. That was choice. That was freedom. That was enough.